Okay, the definition of a wild animal is an animal that can survive on its own, live in a free condition, and provide its own food. It it needs nothing. Okay, or it needs no one. It relies on no one. If you have a squirrel, for instance, in your yard, okay, it doesn't depend on you to feed it. It can crawl on any tree at once. It can do what it wants to do when it wants to do. It's free. Okay, it finds its own food. It finds its own shelter. It gets away from predators on its own. If it's something like a coyote hunts on its own. Okay, it finds its own shelter, things like that. If it doesn't, it dies, or if it gets too weak to do those things, or it's going to die. So it survives on its own. It doesn't rely on anybody. A tame animal is an individual wild animal made submissive to humans. Basically, it's become used to humans. It relies on people for food. You're typically going to find these in zoos and things like that. So I know like a lot of people like to, like I mentioned, the squirrel. People will put squirrel food out there. They'll put corn out there for the squirrel. And if that squirrel gets so used to those people, where it comes right up to people, and it relies on them for food, you would call that tame. I once knew a guy from my hometown that had a pet squirrel that would actually sit on his shoulder. I think he actually rescued it when it was little and raised it, and it was tame. It was a wild animal. All the genetics of a wild animal, if you tested its DNA compared to the squirrel in your backyard, it's very, it's the exact same DNA. But this thing had become so used to humans and so reliant on humans that it couldn't live on its own. Most of the animals in zoos are tamed animals. They are wild animals that would not survive on their own without the help of humans feeding them and taking care of them from predators or things like that. So there is a difference there. A lot of times tamed animals like in zoos will live longer than wild animals. A lion in the zoo will live much longer than a lion out on the African safari, because if a lion in the African safari is not fast enough to catch prey, it's going to die. Okay, well, if a lion in the Omaha Zoo is getting older and getting slower, it doesn't matter, because it's still going to get fed the same. It's still going to be protected from rival lions and things like that. So tamed animals tend to live longer than wild animals. My brother, I think it was last year, actually had 3 raccoon babies that were tame. They were wild raccoons, but he found them. He tamed them, and they were kind of like cats. They crawl all over you, and they relied on him for food. Domesticated is an animal that we've bred specially for a job. Okay, so animals that humans have tamed and bred for special purposes in large numbers. The first thing that comes to mind is your dog. Your dog is domesticated for a specific task. Now, most of our dogs right now, it's to keep us company and to curl up on our lap or whatever. But at one point, they were all wolves. They were wild dogs that were tamed and bred for a certain job. It's really fun to to just look up a random breed of a dog, and it'll lead you to another one and another one and another one, and it'll tell you the history of that dog. Basically, what was it bred for? Like a Jack Russell Terrier, for instance, was bred to fit down rodent holes and kill rodents. Okay, if you guys know what a Jack Russell Terrier is, it's those white and black yipper dogs, I call them. They're tiny, but they're like ferocious, and they think they're tough. Which they were bred to fit in small spaces and kill rodents and be aggressive. So that's why they're like that, is because they took, hey, this one's small and kind of feisty, we'll breed it with this one that's small and kind of feisty, and they had small feisty babies, and then they bred them again, small feisty with small feisty, and before you know it, you had this small dog that could hunt rodents. Other ones were domesticated for guard dogs, like I think I like the mastiff, the bull mastiff or the English mastiff. They're huge dogs, and they were meant for guarding things. Okay, or like huskies were bred to pull sleds in snow. That's their specialty. They love the snow. They were bred specifically for that. So they were domesticated from a wild animal. We picked which ones had babies with which ones, and over time it changed things. All of our livestock is domesticated. If you think about the chicken, at one point there was a wild chicken, and people captured them and bred them together to make domesticated chickens. And the whole thing behind, if you're thinking about chickens for meat, for instance, they basically said, "Oh, here's a big-bodied chicken. Let's take this rooster and put it with this hen, this male and this female," and then they had big-bodied chicken babies, and then they bred them again and again, and over time, chickens got bigger, and their wings got weaker, or just weren't able to keep up with their body size changes. And that's why chickens can't fly very well, is because their bodies got bigger than their wings as we domesticated those. With cows, we said, okay, this cow gives a lot of milk. Let's breed it with this male bull that whose mother gave lots of milk, and then they had babies that gave more milk, and over time we have milk cows. So we've domesticated a lot of things. All of your pets have been domesticated. All domestic animals were once wild. They rely on people for food and shelter. Most domesticated animals, if you set them free, they wouldn't survive very long in the wild. They wouldn't know how to find food or escape predators, or find shelter, because they've been domesticated. Some of that wildness, that instinct has been taken out of it. I remember growing up, I had a cousin who had rabbits, and he had this one rabbit. I don't know why, but he decided to let it go free. Okay, and it was this white puffy rabbit, and he set this rabbit free, and it took off, and it ran about 20 feet, and the cat got it. A cat just pounced on it, because it didn't know, it didn't know what was dangerous, where it should run, how it should hide, things like that. So your dog probably wouldn't survive without your help, without you feeding it and providing it shelter. There's also a thing called feral animals. A feral animal is a domesticated animal that becomes wild. So there are a few animals that become feral. Horses, for example, wild dogs, cats. And basically, it's a domesticated animal that has escaped or been let loose, and they kind of go back to being wild. They breed, and they can survive on their own. The the wild horses, and it kind of is like a staple of America, but like wild horses roaming the prairie. At one point, those horses escaped or were let loose, and then they bred and bred and bred, and those are feral animals. Growing up, we'd always go to the library once a week and to get books and whatever. And my brother would always rent this old videotape. It was called "The Wild Ponies of Chincoteague Island." It's a little island off of, I think off of like Boston, New England, that kind of area there. And what I'm not exactly sure where it was, but anyways, this small island was covered with horses, wild horses. And what had happened was ships would stop there several hundred years ago. They would let their horses off because they were going on a long trip. They would let their horses off to like eat grass and exercise and whatever. And some of them ran off and they couldn't catch them. So instead of trying to catch them and catch them and catch them, they had to leave. So they just left some horses there. And those horses over time bred and bred and bred, and they became this whole island was covered with these feral horses. They were domesticated that then became wild again. I just read a couple weeks ago about how feral hogs are a huge problem in Texas. How you can go to Texas and pay someone some money, and there's companies that will take you up in a helicopter, give you a machine gun, and have you just shoot as many feral hogs as possible. Because what's happening is these hogs got out, they became wild again. They reproduce like crazy. Like you can have 15 to 20 pigs in a litter of pigs, and they reproduce really fast. And they're ripping up like crops. So like a small group of hogs can rip up a whole field of crops really fast. So you can actually rent someone to take you up in a helicopter and use a machine gun on pigs, wild hogs, because they're everywhere and they're a really problem, and they're trying to get rid of some of those. So that would be feral. So the big thing out of today is I want you to know the difference between wild, okay, something that is free, does its own thing, relies on nothing else for food or shelter. Tame is a wild animal that relies on people, a lot of time in zoos and things like that. Domesticated is a wild animal that was tamed and bred for certain things, like your dog, like a chicken. And then feral is a domesticated animal that became wild again. For tomorrow, I would like you to watch the YouTube video here, The Human Batman. This is pretty incredible. You guys probably know what echolocation is. It was one of the questions on your Bat Web Quest, basically making sounds to figure out where you're at, like sonar. They'll use them like whales and dolphins will make clicking sounds and sounds so they can see underwater. And this guy is blind, and he actually does this so he can go for a walk, and he's blind, and he'll know where things are at, and he won't like walk into a pole or anything. So take a watch on that. It's something good. You'll like it.